Hello and welcome to Politics Today. And in this programme today we'll be discussing the issue of Islamic finance, also known as Sharia compliant finance, and asking, is there a problem and should we be concerned about it? And my guest to answer these important questions today is Tim Dieppe, the Director of Islamic Affairs at Christian Concern. It's great to have you back on the programme, Tim.
Thank you, Simon.
And really have to commend you and also others at Christian Concern for the valuable work that you do in preserving Christian freedom across this country. And without you, Andrew Williams, and the whole team, I don't know where we'd be. So we're all grateful.
Thank you. It's a great place to work. Yeah.
And your title is that you're Director of Islamic Affairs. Can you tell us what does that involve, and in particular, how does this relate to Christians?
So Islam and the increasing influence of Islam in the nation, across the nation, is one of our concerns, amongst a wide range of concerns that we have at Christian Concern. And it's my job to head up responding to that in different ways, whether it's in politics or in law or in media or other ways, and responding to news items, educating the church, equipping the church, helping the church to understand, A, where we've got to, and B, what we can do about it, and how we can best effectively respond to what Islam has done so far already in this country.
And what are some of the issues that you actually look at? I know that we're going to be talking about Islamic finance very shortly, but what other issues does that kind of cross over? So
Sharia court's a high-profile issue of a quasi-parallel legal system that has emerged, up to 85 Sharia courts, people estimate, across this country, people being systematically discriminated in them. Then there's the influence of Islam in education, Islamic schools, and various issues there, the whole Trojan horse issue that came up, and still issues with many Islamic schools and what they're teaching as well. And the influence of Islam more broadly in the culture, in prisons, in across a wider scheme, media, across halal meat, all these various issues which it touches, and then finance, which we're going to talk about today. Absolutely,
and you've published this excellent publication called What is Wrong with Islamic Finance. Just show it up there, and you can download this from the Christian Concern website. Can you tell us why you produced this booklet, and in particular also can you tell our viewers what is Islamic finance, or its other name is Sharia compliance finance?
So my background is in finance, actually. I worked for 23 years in fund management myself. And actually, at one point, I was asked to run a Sharia fund. So I have some experience of this. I refused to run a Sharia fund. Perhaps it won't surprise you to know that. But it was a difficult decision for me at the time. Yeah. I sort of researched it and got involved in it, and was surprised and amazed at what I found about Islamic finance. And when I talk to people about it, people have very little understanding or very little knowledge about what's really behind Islamic finance. And I just wanted to produce an accessible document that it's 10 points, it's understandable by somebody without any financial background at all, I think. And it just says, hey, here's some issues, quite serious issues actually, with Islamic finance. Why are we promoting it? Why are we accepting it? Why are we allowing it to happen? Why have our financial institutions all gone down this road? Not entirely, but many of them. And why in particular is the government promoting it? And the government, do you know, we're the only non-Islamic country in the world that has issued a sovereign Islamic bond. Why have we gone to this length to encourage this industry?
Absolutely. We'll be finding about that a little bit more. But now let's have a look at Tim in action. And this is a little production he's produced and Christian Concern produced called Islamic Finance.
Many people think there's nothing wrong with Islamic finance. They think it's just another type of finance, maybe with some ethical principles thrown in. But there are serious problems and reasons to be concerned about Islamic finance, and that's why we've produced this video. Islamic finance, or Sharia compliant finance, is based on the idea that the Quran prohibits all forms of interest, and that's where we hit our first problem. The idea that the Quran bans interest is based on a modern, radical interpretation of the Quran. Muslims have in fact borrowed and lent money with interest throughout history, and most still do so today. Most Muslims believe that the Quran prohibits usury or extortionate interest, not all forms of interest. So why are Western financial institutions promoting a modern, radical interpretation of the Quran? In the UK, there are over 20 banks offering Islamic financial services, double the number in the US. The British government is committed to making the UK the Western hub of Islamic finance. In 2014, Britain became the first non-Muslim nation to issue an Islamic bond. Why is the government promoting a radical interpretation of the Quran? Perhaps it is no surprise that Islamic finance is promoted by and associated with extremists. They like Islamic finance because it increases the influence of Sharia law. Accommodating Sharia finance makes it hard to object to Sharia in family law or other areas. Sharia law is inherently discriminatory against both women and non-Muslims. Why are we welcoming its influence in the area of finance? Although Islamic finance claims to be interest-free, it is in fact based on interest. The products contain charges or expected profits that look a lot like interest. Many Muslims have criticised Islamic finance as deceptive. The real aim behind Islamic finance is to create a separate rival financial system. Islamic finance serves to prevent the integration of Muslims into Western societies. Muslims are told they must not use standard financial products. Financial institutions are told that they must create separate and market separate products for Muslims. It serves to benefit the cause of Islamic fundamentalism by fueling the idea that Muslim societies live with distinctive rules. The whole idea of Islamic finance has been created by modern Islamic radicals and serves to benefit Islamic fundamentalism. It's time that our government and the financial institutions woke up to this and stop promoting separate financial products for Muslims. For more information, we've produced a 24-page booklet, What's Wrong with Islamic Finance, which is available on the link below.
There you go. We've got Tim back in the studio. Tim, very good presentation.
Thank you.
Very informative and also very important. But when it comes down to the issue of Islamic finance, you've identified 10 key areas of concern. Why is this such a concern?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is that the main problem that I see is it's based on a modern radical interpretation of the Quran. You know, this idea that the whole of our society seems to have bought into, that the Quran prohibits interest, is actually a modern radical idea. You know, and the Quran prohibits usury, actually, in a similar way to what the Bible prohibits usury as well. Extortionate interest is prohibited in the Quran, and it explicitly says doubling and quadrupling your money in one of the verses about that. But some fundamentalist Muslims came along and said, you know, actually, let's reinterpret this. Let's make it into a separate system. Let's say we ban interest. And in doing so, they created a separate system and a new way of interpreting the Quran. And it's a fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran too. And the aim behind that is to create a separate financial system for Muslims. You know, one of the things that you can identify is, say, if you've got an Islamic financial product, what finance is being used to finance that product? Well, theoretically, that should be an Islamic financial product too. And therefore, you end up, logically, with a completely separate system, isolated from the rest of the financial system altogether. And so Islamic finance, what worries me is it's promoted by extremists or fundamentalists, or it's based on a fundamentalist interpretation. It originated in the 1970s with some of the fundamentalist groups that were wanting to promote a separatist system. And they've managed to make this into the mainstream interpretation, or the mainstream interpretation according to Western eyes. But actually, as I sort of said in that video, most Muslims still today borrow and lend at interest, even in countries where there are Islamic financial products. That's what they do. In this country, even though there are plenty of Islamic financial products, it's a minority of Muslims who actually use them. Only 36%, according to the Islamic Bank of Britain's own survey in 2013, use any Sharia-compliant products, and 9% use them exclusively. That means 90% plus of Muslims in this country are using conventional financial products. They don't believe that the Quran prohibits interest, and they're right. The Quran doesn't. And so, why are we offering these products that are encouraging a fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran is my key question.
So I suppose the lead-on question from what you've just said is, what is in it for the Islamic extremists to actually push Islamic finance? Or what do they hope to achieve by pushing this on our financial institutions in London?
So I think there's two or three things. One is that it creates a separate system for Muslims. But the other one is that it legitimizes Sharia law in the area of finance. So if you're working in Islamic finance or Sharia finance, if you're promoting Sharia finance, because you're promoting Sharia here, it's hard to object to Sharia over there. So, are you going to object to Sharia in family law and Sharia in discrimination in other ways? That's harder to do because you've accepted Sharia here. You've said it's okay here. So it's harder to say it's not okay over there. So you've legitimized Sharia. There's money involved. Everyone likes money. So there's lots of opportunity for money. The people who are advising people on it get money. There's lots of money in the Islamic world to come from this. And then there is the whole thing of zakat. Zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's where you give 2.5% of your money away, often to Islamic charities or Islamic groups. And so a lot more zakat is generated through Islamic finance than would be generated without it. And the biggest funding of terrorism in the world today is through zakat. And there are rulings on the internet that you can find that say that zakat can be used or should be used even to finance terrorism. So this is another reason why extremists like it and want to promote it. So you can see an agenda behind it there that is subversive in the way it wants to be promoted.
Yeah. So if we take a couple of years ago, our former Prime Minister David Cameron launched in a big conference that Britain was going to issue the first Islamic bond outside of any Islamic nation, and he also declared that he wanted to make Sharia compliance finance London the capital for this new form of Islamic finance around the world, and it'd be the centre in the Western world. Was he naive when he was saying these things, or was he only interested in looking at Islamic investment into London whilst ignoring the potential pitfalls of creating a rival economic system?
I think the politicians just see it as a financial opportunity. They see it as a way of expanding the financial exporting of our financial system in London, and a way of attracting Arab money, which they want to attract. And they don't see the pitfalls and problems and issues with it. In fact, there are Islamic nations that have banned Islamic finance in the past before because of these problems. And here we are welcoming it. And it's interesting because they issued this Sukuk Islamic bonds in 2014, like you say, and it was placed over some government buildings. And most people are aware that their Houses of Parliament need to be refurbished, and they're wondering where to go while it's being refurbished. And one of the places they've considered is Richmond House, where the Department of Health is. But that comes under this Islamic bond, and so there's been multiple press reports saying that they're concerned that you wouldn't be able to serve alcohol in Richmond House because of the Sharia compliance of this Islamic bond. That'd be a disaster for the MPs and politicians. No alcohol, can you imagine? How could they function without that? So, a huge debate for them. But the point is, it highlights the potential risks here, because you've given authority to a Sharia advisory board. All these Sharia financial products have some kind of Sharia advisory board that is paid money and given authority to adjudicate or to decide or determine, is it Sharia compliant or not? And who knows exactly what their legal remit is in that. And even if it's not a legal remit, if they say it's not Sharia compliant, suddenly there's a problem. So, this kind of thing opens up a can of worms as to who has authority to determine whether this is Sharia compliant or not. What if they say, actually, no, we've changed our minds, it needs to also have this, it needs to also have that compliance in there, and suddenly you've opened through the back door a way for increased influence of Sharia in a wider sphere.
Now we know that some of our politicians, so maybe most of our politicians, are a little bit naive when it comes to this issue, not really looking into the major problems and major implications of Islamic finance. But you would have thought that maybe those who work in the financial industry, particularly in the city, and knowing that that London is one of the financial capitals of the world when it comes to finance, that they would be more clued up to the concerns regarding Islamic finance. In the case of studying this, and in case of your experience, are bankers and are financiers fully aware of the true implications of Islamic finance?
No. So what financial people are aware of is that Islamic finance is deceptive, right? It says it's not based on interest, but it is actually based on interest. And it's pretty obvious to anybody who really understands anything about finance, and even to people who don't, that that's the case. If you look at an Islamic mortgage advert, and there's one in the little video I showed them, but it's perhaps hard to read on the video, they advertise it as rent, not interest. But what is the rent? It's not £269, it's 2.69%. That's a funny rent, isn't it? And then you notice there's a discounted variable rent, right? I mean, what do you think that varies on, right? It's interest in disguise. It's interest by any other name. And, so it's a totally deceptive system. And anybody working in finance knows that, understands it, gets it. In fact, Muslims get it as well. And there have been a lot of Muslims who criticise Islamic finance because they're like, this is a deceptive system, which is worse in the eyes of Allah, says one commentator, to deceive people or to have a little bit of interest. It's deceptive and we shouldn't be allowing it. So Muslim critiques and, reformist or moderate Muslims think this is a deceptive system, we shouldn't be promoting it. So, and as Western financial institutions and people, we should be encouraging those voices in the Islamic community, not the ones who are saying, no, we need a distinctive financial system. Forget there isn't a Christian distinctive financial system or a Jewish or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Sikh or anything else. There's only an Islamic one, and it's an Islamic fundamentalist one. And so, why are we giving that a whole separate system to come in there, particularly when we know how deceptive and how fundamentalist the interpretation is that's based on?
And how will this have an impact on other industries, such as, for example, the drinking industry, alcohol industry, the gambling industry, and even farmers themselves? How will Islamic financing have an impact on these companies?
So Islamic financial products would not invest in those industries, and that's an issue. But I think more the issue is just in the financial world itself. They won't invest in conventional finance either. They won't invest in conventional banks, conventional insurance companies, conventional anything like that. And so in the financial world, it ends up becoming a rival and a separate system, and that's a concern, I think.
Absolutely. You produced this book, and if I just flick through some of these headlines you've got here, for example, we've got this one: Islamic finance is promoted by and associated with Islamic extremists, and looking at the kind of history within Islam, even the time when Islam was at its most powerful, probably during the time of the Ottoman Empire, there was no such thing then as there was of Islamic finance as a whole. So who's developed this, and what individuals and what Islamic governments are pushing Sharia finance? Yeah,
so there's various individuals involved in promoting it, people in the 1970s promoting it. One of the lead promoters in the world today is a chap called Sheikh Taqi Usmani, and he's still quoted today or frequently in the FT and other places as a leading expert on Islamic finance. And when I first looked into this, he was the chairman of the Sharia Advisory Board at HSBC, and he's been on HSBC and various other major financial institutions' Sharia boards. Taqi Usmani has written a book which is printed in English, and in this book there's a question that he responds to. The question is, do we still need to wage jihad in a country where we can freely build mosques and preach Islam? A country like Britain, in other words. And he says, well, according to the Quran, killing should continue until they pay the jizya tax. That's the subjugation tax for non-Muslims, right? And he actually says that the Quran doesn't say killing should continue until we can preach Islam and build mosques, right? It says that killing should continue until they pay the jizya. So he is an extremist. He would support terrorism. He would support violence in order to promote Islam, most definitely. And it was only when I highlighted this to a friend of mine at HSBC, and he passed it on to compliance. Compliance had a fit, and they got rid of him from that board. But who was left on that board? His son was left on that board. All the other imams who'd sat next to him and with him and undoubtedly shared his views, or at least knew and sympathised with his views. So that opened my eyes to what's really behind this. If someone like that is in such high prominence and such high profile in this industry and promoting it so aggressively, his agenda is not just let's have a different financial system. His agenda is let's have Sharia law across the whole world. Let's have Sharia law in the UK. Let's have Sharia law in all different places. And he sees Sharia finance as a way of promoting that agenda, a way of extending that agenda and obtaining finance for that agenda and encouraging a more fundamental interpretation of the Quran more generally. And that's the issue that you see with this in terms of what's going on behind the scenes and what's the real agenda behind Islamic finance.
So by interpreting what you've just said, Tim, is it fair enough to say that really this is a rival economic system to rival what we have in the West, and to encourage Muslims and Islamic countries to invest in Islamic compliant finance, so that they don't invest in so-called Western finance and the profit margin, so they can set up their kind of separate economic system. And so therefore, is this then to back up their desires and dreams to establish an Islamic caliphate, which they hope to create a one world Islamic government?
Yes, what you said I totally agree with, and it generally expands the influence of Sharia and Sharia law generally. What it also does, of course, is segregates Muslims. It says to Muslims, you can't integrate into society in the financial world. You have to use separate products and go to separate institutions to do that. You can't have a normal bank account, you can't have a normal mortgage, you can't have a normal insurance product, you can't do this, you can't do that, you must be separate. And this is part of the agenda of the Islamists. They want to segregate, they want to separate, they want to prevent integration of Muslims and have them to have their own separate distinctive identity and live by distinctive separate rules, hence the Sharia courts, which I mentioned earlier. And the government is meant to be promoting integration, want to encourage integration, and so should the financial institutions want to encourage integration, and yet they're promoting Islamic finance, which encourages segregation and separation and distinctiveness, and you've got to have your own separate products and your own separate way of doing things. So it hinders integration and works against integration as well.
That's fascinating. Why should our politicians be concerned about this, as well as our financiers concerned about the growing influence of Sharia finance, particularly here in Britain?
Well, I think for all those reasons, I think it's encouraging a fundamentalist interpretation. It's increasing the influence of Sharia law, and Sharia law is discriminatory system and a liberal system, undemocratic system. It's promoting segregation of Muslims, and it's encouraging fundamentalists across the country and across the world, and helping finance them. So, why would we encourage a system that does that? Why would we? What are the benefits? I don't see the benefits other than, it does attract money, but the benefits for society more generally are not there. I don't see them.
And also the connection that many of this money that's used in Sharia finance could be used to fund terrorist operations or support terrorist activities as well. And that's one of the major concerns, isn't it? Because we know that bin Laden very much used the stock market and the financial systems in order to fund terrorist operations against the West. Surely that's one of the major concerns.
This is the thing, it's all based on deception. In finance, the last thing you should want is deception, right? But it's a deceptive system. It claims to have no interest, and it is interest. It's based on interest, right? Furthermore, because you are covering up the fact that it has interest, you're layering systems and you're doing things in order to sort of disguise the fact that it's got interest, and that adds complexity to the product. And that complexity that's been added looks very similar to the complexity of money laundering systems. So actually it's vulnerable to money laundering, and in fact the IMF recently produced a report that highlighted that actually Islamic finance, because you've got these different layerings and deceptive systems, is more vulnerable to money laundering than conventional finance. So there's a question as well, why would you allow it on that basis, that these deceptive systems and the increased propensity to money laundering? And then furthermore, because of that deception, because of these laundering, because of these issues, it actually adds complexity to the product, and that complexity adds cost to the product. So you're actually disadvantaging Muslims because they're having to pay for additional complexity in the product relative to other financial products. So it disadvantages the Muslims who use it. So,
Tim, we're down to probably last minute or so of the programme. So within 30 seconds, how can our viewers respond to the rise of Islamic finance in this country?
Get hold of my booklet on the website that we've highlighted, read it, tell your friends about it, give it to your friends, talk to anybody who works in finance. Did they know this? Do they know this stuff? At the moment, the thing is just making people aware. It's amazing how unaware people are of what's really going on in Islamic finance.
Excellent. Tim, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on this edition of Politics Today, and this superb booklet that you've produced, which is called Islamic Finance, and you can download that from the Christian Concern website. So thank you for educating and informing us about this very important issue, Tim.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Politics Today. We have to be concerned when we look at Sharia finance or Islamic finance and the influence that that has on our financial system here in London, and our politicians, also our financiers in the city, should also be concerned about this, because of the impact that this has on the nation to allow the implication of Sharia law to be implemented in this country. So I want to thank you for watching today's Politics Today, and we'll see you next time.